I discovered my daughter-in-law had crossed a line with my husband exactly 1 week before we were supposed to finalize our divorce, and the strange part is that the moment I realized it, I didn't feel the urge to scream or slam a door the way people do in movies. I simply stood in my quiet kitchen at 9:17 on a Tuesday evening, the kind of ordinary night when the refrigerator hum is louder than the television, and I watched Daniel's phone light up on the granite counter. The message preview appeared for just a second before the screen dimmed again, but that second was enough. I saw her name. Ashley. My son's wife. My daughter-in-law. The message itself was short, something casual, something that would look harmless to anyone who didn't know the rhythm of the man it was sent to. I had been married to Daniel Hayes for 42 years. I knew the difference between a normal message and the kind that carried a secret underneath it. I didn't pick up the phone right away. I just stood there, holding the dish towel I had been using to dry a coffee mug, and listened to the quiet house around me. The dishwasher clicked softly. The clock above the stove ticked once every second. It's strange how calm a room can feel at the exact moment something inside your life breaks. Eventually I did reach for the phone. I didn't open the message fully. I didn't need to. The preview alone told me enough to understand what had been happening behind my back. I set the phone down exactly where it had been, lined up neatly with the edge of the counter, just the way Daniel always left it. Then I poured myself a cup of tea. Not because I was thirsty, but because doing something small and ordinary helped my hand stop shaking. 1 week. That's how much time remained before Daniel and I were scheduled to sit in a quiet office downtown and sign the final divorce papers that would close the chapter of our marriage. 42 years together reduced to a stack of documents and a couple of signatures. I had already accepted that part. What I hadn't expected was that the person standing on the other side of that secret text would be someone who called me mom at every family dinner. For a long time I simply stood at the window above the sink and looked out at the dark backyard. The porch light cast a pale circle over the grass, and beyond it everything faded into shadow. I could hear Daniel moving around upstairs, opening drawers, walking across the bedroom floor like it was any normal night in a normal house. And that's when I realized something important. If I confronted him right then, I would only hear excuses. If I called Ashley, I would only hear denial. But if I stayed quiet, if I pretended not to know, then they would keep acting exactly the way they had been. People reveal everything when they believe no one is watching. So I finished my tea, rinsed the cup, and placed it carefully in the sink. Upstairs, Daniel laughed softly at something on his television. I turned off the kitchen light, walked toward the staircase, and made a decision that neither of them would see coming. For the next 7 days I would say absolutely nothing. I did exactly what I promised myself that night. I said nothing. The next morning the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Sunlight came through the kitchen window at the same angle. The coffee maker hummed the same quiet sound it made every day at 7 o'clock. Daniel walked downstairs wearing the gray sweater he liked to wear when the weather turned cool, and he greeted me with the same calm voice he had used for decades. He asked if I had slept well. I told him I had. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the counter reading the news on his phone. I watched him for a moment, wondering how easily a person could carry two versions of their life in the same pocket. The phone rested in his hand like it had the night before, but this time the screen stayed dark. A few minutes later he left for work, grabbing his car keys from the ceramic bowl by the door. He kissed the air somewhere near my cheek, the way people do when they are already halfway out of the room. The front door closed and the house became quiet again. I washed the 2 coffee cups slowly and placed them in the rack beside the sink. The routine felt ordinary, but inside my mind something had shifted. For 42 years I had believed that silence meant weakness. That morning I realized silence could also be a form of patience. Later that afternoon Ashley stopped by the house. She said she was in the neighborhood and wanted to drop off a container she had borrowed during the last family dinner. The plastic lid clicked softly when she set it on the kitchen counter. She smiled the same bright smile she had used since the day my son introduced her to the family. Her hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a light blue sweater that looked new. She asked how I was doing and whether the divorce process was going smoothly. Her voice sounded gentle, almost concerned. I noticed how carefully she avoided looking at Daniel's empty chair at the dining table. I offered her a cup of tea and she accepted. We sat across from each other for a few minutes discussing ordinary things. The weather had cooled down earlier that week. The grocery store on Maple Avenue had started putting pumpkins outside for the fall season. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have believed they were watching a simple conversation between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law on a quiet afternoon. Ashley thanked me for the tea and said she needed to get going. When she stood up from the table, she placed her hand lightly on my shoulder and told me that everything would work out in the end. I smiled back at her and wished her a safe drive home. After the door closed, I remained seated at the table for a long time. The tea had already gone cold, but I did not move the cup. I simply looked at the chair she had been sitting in and thought about how easily people step into a room when they believe the truth has not caught up with them yet. Outside, a car drove slowly down the street and the leaves in the front yard shifted in the wind. I glanced at the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. 6 days remained before the meeting at the lawyer's office downtown, where Daniel and I were scheduled to sign the final documents. 6 days was more than enough time to watch carefully, listen quietly, and begin putting a few important pieces into place. I began to notice how carefully ordinary life continued around me during those next few days. On Wednesday morning, Daniel left the house earlier than usual, saying he had a meeting across town. I nodded and wished him a good day, then watched through the kitchen window as his car disappeared around the corner. The street was quiet after he left. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the mailbox and a neighbor walked her golden retriever along the sidewalk. Everything looked normal from the outside, and that was exactly why I kept my routine unchanged. I watered the small plants on the windowsill. I folded the laundry that had finished drying the night before. I even drove to the grocery store on Maple Avenue the same way I did every week, pushing a cart down the aisles while soft music played through the speakers above. Yet while I moved through those simple errands, my mind was arranging something much more deliberate. That afternoon, I called the attorney who had been handling the divorce paperwork. His office was located in a modest brick building downtown, just 2 blocks from the courthouse. I told the receptionist my name and she transferred the call. When Mr. Callahan answered, his voice sounded calm and professional as always. I explained that I needed to review a few additional details before the final signing. There was a brief pause on the line while he listened. Then he asked if I could come by the next morning. I arrived at his office at 9:30 the following day. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Framed certificates lined the wall behind the reception desk. Mr. Callahan greeted me with a polite handshake and guided me into his office, where a large oak desk sat near the window. I explained everything carefully, speaking in the same steady tone I had been using all week. I described the message I had seen on Daniel's phone, and the way Ashley had appeared at the house pretending nothing had changed. Mr. Callahan listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. He said that timing often reveals more truth than confrontation. Then he asked me one simple question. Did I want the meeting scheduled for the following week to proceed exactly as planned? I told him yes. I wanted everything to appear completely ordinary. He nodded slowly and opened a folder on his desk. We reviewed the existing documents first. The division of property, the closing of joint accounts, the quiet finality of legal language. But then he reached into a drawer and removed a blank envelope. He placed it on the desk between us. The gesture was small, but it carried a quiet weight. We spoke for nearly an hour, discussing what could be included, what would remain sealed until the right moment, and how the order of events would unfold when everyone sat down together in that office next week. When I left the building, the afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows across the street. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the light warm my face. Somewhere across town, Daniel was probably going about his day, believing the next week would be simple and predictable. Ashley likely believed the same thing. They both assumed the story had already been written. What they did not understand was that the final page had not yet been placed on the table. By Friday, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm that almost felt peaceful if someone did not look too closely. Daniel continued to behave exactly the way he always had during the final weeks of our marriage. He spoke politely at breakfast. He asked whether I needed anything from the store. Sometimes he stood near the doorway with his car keys in his hand and mentioned small things about work that sounded ordinary and unremarkable. I listened with the same calm expression I had practiced all week. In many ways, the silence between us had existed long before any of this began. It had simply taken a different shape now. That evening he returned home just after 6 o'clock carrying a paper bag from a restaurant downtown. He said he thought it would be easier if we both avoided cooking for a while. The food smelled like roasted chicken and herbs when he placed the containers on the kitchen counter. I thanked him and set 2 plates on the table the same way I had done for decades. We sat across from each other under the warm light of the dining room lamp while the television murmured softly in the living room. Daniel talked about a construction project his company had started near the river. I nodded occasionally and took small bites of my meal. The entire conversation felt strangely distant, like listening to a radio program in another room. At one point his phone vibrated gently on the table beside his elbow. He glanced down at it for only a moment before turning the screen face down against the wood surface. That small motion was enough for me to understand who had probably sent the message. I did not ask about it. Instead, I reached for my glass of water and continued eating as though nothing had happened. After dinner he carried the empty containers to the trash and thanked me for the quiet evening. Later that night I walked through the house turning off lights one by one. The hallway lamp, the small light above the stove, the reading lamp near the sofa where I used to spend winter afternoons with a book. Each room looked familiar yet slightly different. The way a place can feel when you already know you will not remain there much longer. Before going upstairs I paused beside the kitchen counter where Daniel usually left his phone when he slept. The counter was empty that night. He must have taken it with him to the bedroom. I did not need to see another message to know that the pattern had not changed. People rarely stop when they believe they are invisible. I simply placed a clean dish towel beside the sink and checked the calendar again. 4 days remained before the meeting downtown. 4 quiet days where everything appeared normal from the outside. The strange thing about waiting is that it sharpens the way you notice details. The sound of footsteps on the staircase. The soft click of a bedroom door closing. The faint glow of light beneath it. As I stood there in the dim kitchen I realized something very clear. Daniel believed the coming week would end one chapter of his life in a simple and predictable way. Ashley likely believed the same thing. They were both moving toward that meeting with complete confidence, certain that the story was already finished. What neither of them understood was that the most important moment had not happened yet, and when it finally arrived it would unfold in a quiet office with polished floors, a wooden table, and one envelope they had never expected to see. Saturday morning arrived quietly, the kind of calm morning that makes a house feel almost peaceful, if someone does not know what is waiting just beneath the surface. The sun filtered through the thin curtains in the kitchen and painted long pale lines across the wooden floor. I woke up earlier than usual and made coffee before Daniel came downstairs. The smell filled the room slowly, warm and familiar. For a moment it reminded me of the early years of our marriage when mornings used to feel simple and hopeful. When Daniel finally entered the kitchen he looked slightly tired, though he tried to hide it behind the same polite smile he had been wearing all week. He poured himself a cup of coffee and asked if I had any plans for the weekend. I told him I might drive into town to pick up a few things. It was not entirely untrue. There were a few errands I needed to complete before Monday arrived. He nodded and scrolled through his phone while standing near the counter. I noticed the small way he angled the screen away from me, as if the habit had become automatic. After breakfast he left the house again, saying he needed to stop by his office for a few hours. When the front door closed behind him I waited until the sound of his car faded down the street. Then I walked upstairs to the bedroom we had shared for decades. The room looked almost unchanged from the outside. The same framed photograph of our son on the dresser. The same quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. But when I opened the closet I felt the quiet distance that had been growing between us for years. Daniel had already packed several boxes earlier in the week, preparing to move into an apartment after the divorce was finalized. His side of the closet looked half empty now. I stood there for a moment studying the space, then closed the door and returned downstairs. By mid-morning I was driving toward downtown again. The sky was clear and the roads were calm, with only a few cars moving through the intersections. When I reached the brick building where Mr. Callahan's office was located I parked along the curb and walked inside. The receptionist recognized me and offered a polite smile. A few minutes later I sat across from the same oak desk while Mr. Callahan reviewed the documents we had discussed earlier in the week. He spoke slowly and carefully, making sure every detail was exactly where it needed to be. The envelope we had prepared rested near the corner of the desk. Its surface looked plain and unremarkable, the way important things often do before they are opened. We confirmed the time of the meeting scheduled for Monday morning. Daniel would arrive expecting a routine final step. Ashley had told him she might stop by the office afterward to help him organize some paperwork. The timing worked perfectly. When our conversation ended, Mr. Callahan placed the envelope neatly inside the folder that would be brought into the conference room. I thanked him and left the building once again. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had earlier that week. Autumn was settling into the city little by little. As I walked back toward my car, I realized something important about the way the last few days had unfolded. Daniel and Ashley believed the coming meeting would close a quiet chapter of their lives. They thought the truth had already been hidden safely behind polite conversations and careful smiles. What they did not understand was that patience has a way of gathering strength in silence. And by the time Monday morning arrived, everything they believed would finally be placed in front of them on a simple wooden table. Monday morning arrived with a quiet kind of clarity. The sky was pale blue and the air carried the cool edge of early autumn. I woke before the alarm and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while the house remained completely silent. For a long moment I simply watched the light shift slowly across the floor. It was the last morning I would ever sit in that kitchen as Daniel's wife, yet the thought did not bring the sadness I might have expected years ago. Instead, it felt like the calm that settles in just before a long journey finally begins. Daniel came downstairs a little after 7 o'clock wearing a dark jacket and holding a folder under his arm. He greeted me with a polite nod and poured himself a cup of coffee. His movements looked slightly more careful than usual, the way people behave when they are preparing to close an important chapter of their lives. He mentioned that the meeting with the attorney was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and suggested we leave the house together in about an hour. I agreed. We finished our coffee quietly. The conversation between us was brief and practical, focused only on the schedule for the morning. When we finally walked out to the car, the neighborhood looked calm and unchanged. A neighbor across the street was watering the last flowers in her front yard. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the corner. Nothing about the morning hinted that anything unusual was waiting ahead. The drive into downtown took about 20 minutes. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel while soft music played from the radio. Occasionally he cleared his throat as though he wanted to say something, but the words never came. I watched the buildings pass by through the window and felt the strange calm that had been building inside me all week. When we reached the brick building where Mr. Callahan's office was located, Daniel parked along the curb and turned off the engine. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he picked up the folder he had brought from home and stepped out of the car. Inside the building, the receptionist greeted us with the same polite smile she always used. She guided us down the short hallway toward the conference room where the final documents would be signed. The room itself looked simple and orderly. A polished wooden table stood in the center with 4 chairs arranged neatly around it. A narrow window allowed soft daylight to enter from the side. Mr. Callahan was already there reviewing a stack of papers when we walked in. He greeted Daniel with a professional handshake and gestured for us to sit down. A few minutes later the door opened again and Ashley stepped quietly into the room. She wore a light gray coat and carried a small leather bag. Her expression held that same gentle confidence I had seen all week. She greeted Daniel warmly and nodded politely in my direction before taking a seat near the corner of the table. The moment settled into a calm silence while Mr. Callahan organized the papers in front of him. From the outside, the meeting looked exactly like the simple legal appointment Daniel expected. A husband and wife preparing to sign the final documents of their divorce while a family member waited nearby to help afterward. But as I looked at the folder resting near the center of the table, I knew that everything was about to unfold very differently from the way either of them imagined. Mr. Callahan adjusted the papers in front of him and began speaking in the calm, steady voice that lawyers seem to master after years of practice. He explained that the documents on the table represented the final stage of the legal separation, and that once they were signed, the marriage between Daniel and me would be formally concluded. Daniel listened carefully, nodding once or twice while flipping through the first few pages of the folder he had brought with him. Ashley sat quietly beside him, her hands folded neatly over the leather bag resting on her lap. From a distance she looked relaxed, almost supportive, the way a family member might appear when helping someone through an important transition. The sunlight from the narrow window reached across the polished table and touched the edges of the papers in front of us. Mr. Callahan slid the first document toward Daniel and pointed to the section where a signature would eventually be required. Daniel read through the page slowly. Every movement in the room felt measured and ordinary. A person passing by the office hallway would have heard nothing more than the soft sound of papers turning and the quiet murmur of professional conversation. After several minutes, Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and said that everything appeared to be in order. Mr. Callahan gave a polite nod and reached for another folder resting beside his elbow. The gesture was small, but I noticed the exact moment when Daniel's attention shifted toward it. The folder was not part of the original stack he had been reviewing. It looked identical from the outside, the same neutral color and the same neat label along the edge, yet it had not been there when the meeting began. Mr. Callahan placed it gently on the table and opened it with careful hands. Inside was the plain envelope we had prepared during my earlier visits to the office. He did not open it right away. Instead, he looked toward Daniel and spoke in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning. He explained that before the final documents could be signed, there was one additional matter that needed to be addressed for the sake of clarity in the legal record. Daniel frowned slightly, confused but still composed. Ashley shifted in her chair and glanced briefly toward him as if trying to understand the change in direction. Mr. Callahan then turned the envelope so it faced the center of the table and rested his hand lightly beside it. The room grew very quiet in that moment. Even the faint sounds from the hallway seemed to fade away. Daniel looked at the envelope, then at the attorney and finally toward me. His expression carried the first hint of uncertainty I had seen all morning. Ashley's polite confidence began to fade as well. Her shoulders straightened and her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her bag. Mr. Callahan broke the silence by explaining that the contents of the envelope were documents and communications that had become relevant to the division of certain financial responsibilities. He spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. Daniel leaned forward in his chair and asked what kind of communications he meant. Mr. Callahan answered that it would be easier to understand once the materials were reviewed. With that, he opened the envelope slowly and removed the papers inside, placing them neatly on the table where everyone could see them. The moment the first page turned toward the light, I noticed the exact instant when the calm certainty in Daniel's face began to disappear. Daniel stared at the papers for several seconds before touching them. At first, his expression looked confused, as if he believed there had been some kind of mistake. He lifted the top page slowly and read the lines in silence while the room remained completely still. The sunlight from the window reflected faintly off the polished surface of the table, and I could hear the quiet rustle of paper as he turned the first sheet. Ashley leaned forward slightly in her chair, trying to catch a glimpse of the document from where she sat. Her earlier confidence had faded into a careful kind of curiosity. Mr. Callahan remained calm, his hands folded neatly in front of him while he allowed Daniel the time to read. I watched Daniel's face the way a person studies a horizon just before a storm appears. At first, his eyes moved steadily across the page. Then they slowed. His brow tightened slightly as he reached the middle of the document. Finally, he stopped reading altogether and looked up at the attorney. He asked what exactly he was looking at. Mr. Callahan answered in the same measured tone he had used throughout the meeting. He explained that the documents contained a record of communications and related information that had become relevant to the financial arrangements connected to the divorce. Daniel's gaze shifted toward Ashley for a brief moment before returning to the papers in his hands. Ashley straightened in her chair and leaned closer to the table. When Daniel placed the first sheet down, she quickly reached forward and picked it up. Her eyes moved across the page much faster than his had. The color in her face changed almost immediately. She set the paper back on the table and asked where those messages had come from. Mr. Callahan calmly explained that the materials had been reviewed in advance and were being presented now, so that all matters connected to the separation could be resolved with full transparency. Daniel leaned back in his chair and ran his hand slowly across his forehead. The confident calm he had carried into the room that morning was gone. In its place was a quiet uncertainty that seemed to grow with every second. Ashley spoke again, this time with less composure than before. She said there must be some misunderstanding, and that the situation was being taken out of context. Her voice sounded tighter now, the smooth confidence replaced by something more fragile. Mr. Callahan did not argue with her. He simply pointed to the next page in the stack and suggested that they continue reviewing the material carefully. Daniel picked up the second page and read it more slowly than the first. The silence in the room deepened as the meaning of the documents settled around the table. I remained seated with my hands folded in front of me, watching the moment unfold exactly the way it had been planned days earlier. For an entire week Daniel and Ashley had moved through their routines believing the truth was hidden safely behind polite conversations and quiet smiles. Now the same calm room that had seemed so ordinary only minutes earlier held a very different atmosphere. When Daniel finally placed the second page back onto the table, he did not look at the attorney. Instead he turned his eyes toward me with an expression that carried both confusion and realization. For the first time since the meeting began he understood that the silence I had kept all week had never meant ignorance at all. Daniel continued to stare at me as if the answer to everything might be written somewhere on my face. The confusion in his expression slowly shifted into a heavy realization that settled over the room like a quiet storm. For the first time that morning he looked uncertain about the simple path he had expected this meeting to follow. Ashley remained very still beside him, her earlier confidence replaced by a tension that seemed to tighten her posture with every passing second. Mr. Callahan allowed the silence to remain for a moment before speaking again in his steady professional tone. He explained that the documents on the table did not exist to embarrass anyone, but to clarify financial responsibilities connected to the separation. The information showed a pattern of communication that had taken place during the final stage of the marriage. Daniel looked back down at the pages and slowly read several lines again as though hoping they might change if he examined them closely enough. Ashley shifted in her chair and quietly said that none of this should matter now that the divorce was already being finalized. Her voice sounded smaller than before, almost uncertain. Mr. Callahan responded calmly that in many cases personal relationships might not affect legal proceedings. But when those relationships overlap with financial decisions or shared property, the situation can become more complicated. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly as the meaning of that explanation settled in. He asked what exactly that meant for the agreement they were about to sign. Mr. Callahan reached toward the folder that Daniel had brought earlier and placed the additional documents beside it so the comparison was clear. He explained that the original agreement had been written under certain assumptions about how responsibilities and property would be divided after the separation. However, the information now on the table suggested that those assumptions needed to be reconsidered before any signatures were placed on the final pages. Ashley finally turned toward me directly. For several seconds she searched my face as if trying to understand when everything had changed. The polite smile she had worn all week was gone now. In its place was a look of quiet disbelief. Daniel followed her gaze and looked at me again, this time with a mixture of frustration and something closer to regret. I had remained silent through most of the meeting, but now I gently unfolded my hands and rested them on the table. My voice was calm when I finally spoke. I said that I had not come to the office to create a scene or to prolong the end of the marriage. I had simply come to make sure that the final chapter of our lives was written with honesty instead of quiet secrets. The room grew very still after those words. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair while the papers remained spread across the table between us. Ashley looked down at the documents again, her earlier certainty completely gone. Mr. Callahan quietly gathered the pages into a neat stack and explained that the meeting would continue only after everyone had time to review the revised information carefully. Outside the narrow window the afternoon sunlight had grown brighter, and the calm street below carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Inside the conference room the story that Daniel and Ashley had believed would end quickly had changed into something very different. And as I sat there watching the truth settle across the table, I realized that the quiet patience of the past week had finally brought the exact moment I had been waiting for.